I'm not throwing my life away. I've spent years trying to move forward, and now this. The lawyers will handle the rest.
The doctor's words landed like a verdict. Stage 3. Aggressive. No guarantees. Ethan Cole sat frozen on the edge of the hospital bed, his fingers numb, his future suddenly reduced to statistics and silence. 30 minutes later, before the shock had even settled into fear, his wife walked back into his life. Not with comfort, not with tears, but with divorce papers already filed. No hesitation, no questions, just cold efficiency. She didn't see a husband fighting for his life. She saw a burden she no longer wanted. What Ethan didn't know, what she couldn't possibly imagine, was that on that very same day, a sealed legal file was waiting, holding a truth powerful enough to rewrite everything she thought she had won. Before we dive into this story, take a moment to comment where you're watching from and what time it is there, and if you're drawn to powerful stories of betrayal, justice, and healing. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Long before hospitals and lawyers entered Ethan Cole's life, there had been small, almost invisible fractures in his marriage, cracks so quiet he mistook them for normal wear and tear. He believed relationships aged the way buildings did, settling into themselves, losing shine but gaining stability. He didn't realize some structures weren't settling at all. They were slowly hollowing out. Ethan had met Lila Moore 7 years earlier at a fundraising gala he only attended because his supervisor insisted it would look good. He wore a borrowed suit that never quite fit his shoulders, stood near the drink table, and listened more than he spoke. Lila, on the other hand, moved through the room like she belonged to it. Her laugh was bright, her posture confident, her eyes constantly scanning, measuring value, opportunity, advantage. She noticed Ethan because he was different. Quiet, grounded, safe. He mistook her interest for connection. She mistook his steadiness for something she could lean on until she didn't need it anymore. In the early years, things felt balanced enough. Ethan worked long hours as a compliance analyst, a job that demanded precision and silence. It paid well, not extravagantly, but reliably. He handled the mortgage, the insurance, the utilities. He remembered due dates and birthdays. Lila floated between passions, event planning one year, lifestyle blogging the next, always chasing something bigger, shinier, just out of reach. Whenever her ventures stalled, Ethan filled the gaps without complaint. He told himself that support was love, that sacrifice was partnership. But slowly, Lila's gratitude faded into expectation. She began commenting on things Ethan hadn't noticed before. The car he drove was a little embarrassing. The neighborhood felt temporary. The way he dressed was fine, but forgettable. Each remark was delivered lightly, often with a smile, as if humor erased cruelty. Ethan absorbed them quietly, adjusting where he could, apologizing where he didn't need to. From Ethan's limited perspective, he believed he was failing her in ways he couldn't name. He tried to compensate with effort, more hours at work, fewer objections, more silence. What he didn't see, what he couldn't allow himself to see, was how Lila's affection shifted based on context around influential friends. She stood slightly apart from him. At networking events, she introduced him quickly, then redirected conversations back to herself. At home, warmth had become conditional, something earned through compliance rather than shared freely. By the 5th year of marriage, they lived more like parallel lines than partners. Their conversations became logistical: groceries, schedules, bills. Lila spent more time on her phone than looking at him, laughing at messages she never explained. Ethan noticed, but he trusted. Trust had always been his default setting. When his health first began to decline, it manifested subtly: fatigue that sleep didn't fix, weight loss that didn't make sense. Pain he dismissed as stress. Lila noticed, but only insofar as it disrupted her routine. Doctor appointments were inconvenient. His mood swings were dramatic. His silences were heavy. "You should really get that checked," she said once. Already half distracted, scrolling through her phone, there was no urgency in her voice, No fear, Ethan delayed. He always did. He didn't want to be a problem. He didn't want to confirm what some part of him already suspected, that something fundamental was wrong, not just with his body, but with the life he had built around it. The night before his diagnosis, they barely spoke. Lila was packing for a weekend trip she hadn't clearly explained. Ethan sat at the kitchen table, staring at medical forms, rehearsing how he would tell her if the news was bad. He imagined her reaching for his hand. He imagined reassurance. He imagined partnership. None of those images included divorce papers. Looking back, the imbalance had always been there. Ethan had invested in permanence. Lila had invested in upward mobility. He built roots. She built exits. But from inside the marriage, it didn't look like betrayal. It looked like compromise. It looked like being patient. It looked like love that required endurance. The cruelest part was that Ethan believed, even as his health declined, that if something truly serious happened, Lila would step up, that whatever distance existed between them would collapse in the face of real crisis. That marriage vows meant something when tested. He had no idea she had already made her decision. By the time Ethan finally sat in that hospital room, listening to words that rearranged his future, Lila had emotionally left long ago. The diagnosis didn't scare her. It clarified things. It turned a quiet dissatisfaction into an exit strategy. From Ethan's perspective, the betrayal felt sudden. From Lila's, it was overdue. And somewhere far away, sealed behind legal language and signatures written years earlier, another truth waited patiently. One that would soon expose just how uneven this ground had always been. The hospital smelled like antiseptic and burnt coffee, a combination that clung to the back of Ethan Cole's throat long after the appointment ended. He sat alone in the examination room, hands folded tightly in his lap, staring at a laminated poster of the human lymphatic system, red and blue lines traced through a body that looked nothing like his, too clean, too certain. The doctor spoke carefully, choosing words the way someone steps across thin ice. Ethan heard them in fragments at first. Advanced, stage 3. Aggressive but treatable. Each term landed separately, never quite forming a complete sentence in his mind. His chest felt hollow, as if something essential had been scooped out and replaced with cold air. He nodded when expected, asked the right questions automatically. Survival rates, treatment timelines, side effects. His voice sounded distant to his own ears, like it belonged to someone braver, steadier, inside. Panic clawed upward, but years of emotional restraint kept it contained, compressed into a tight pressure behind his ribs. When the doctor finally paused, giving him space to react, Ethan reached for his phone. Leela's name sat at the top of his contacts, a familiarity that suddenly felt fragile. His thumb hovered for a moment before pressing call. It rang twice. Voicemail. He tried again. Straight to voicemail this time. A flicker of irritation surfaced, quickly smothered by rationalization. She might be busy. In a meeting. Driving. He left a short message, careful to sound calm. Hey, I'm at the hospital. I need to talk to you. It's important. He didn't say why. The nurse returned with paperwork, moving efficiently, kindly, unaware she was watching a life fracture. She explained the next steps: scheduling, oncology referrals, insurance approvals. Ethan signed, where indicated, his signature steady despite the tremor in his hands. As he walked out into the corridor, the world felt muted. Conversations blurred together. Footsteps echoed too loudly. He leaned against the wall briefly, pressing his palm to the cool surface, grounding himself. He reminded himself to breathe. This was the moment he had always believed marriage was meant for. Not the celebrations, not the photos. This. He imagined Lila's face when he told her. The initial shock, the worry, maybe guilt for their recent distance, maybe a return to something warmer. He clung to the image as if it were a life raft. 30 minutes later, she arrived. Her heels clicked sharply against the hospital floor, each step precise. Controlled, she didn't rush. She didn't look panicked. When she reached him, her expression was composed, eyes assessing the room rather than his face. "You sounded serious," she said. Voice level. He nodded, swallowing. "I was diagnosed," he began. The words tasted metallic. "Cancer. Stage 3. For a split second, something flickered across her face. Not fear, not grief. Calculation. She exhaled slowly, as if absorbing an inconvenience. "Okay," she said. "What does that mean?" Ethan explained, stumbling slightly now that the words were real, now that they existed outside the sterile room. Chemotherapy, long-term treatment, uncertainty. He waited for her to interrupt, to ask questions, to reach for him. She didn't. When he finished, silence stretched between them, thick and uncomfortable. Lila adjusted the strap of her purse on her shoulder, glancing down the corridor. "I've already filed for divorce," she said finally. The sentence landed harder than the diagnosis. Ethan stared at her, convinced he had misheard. "What? She reached into her bag and pulled out a manila folder, holding it out with both hands, like a formal exchange. "The paperwork went through this morning. You'll be served officially, but I thought it was better you hear it from me." His mind struggled to process both realities at once. Cancer, divorce. They collided, overlapping, each amplifying the other, until he could barely separate physical pain from emotional shock. "You're leaving," he said, the words flat. "I'm being realistic," Lila replied. "This isn't what I signed up for." Her tone was calm, almost rehearsed, as if she had practiced this conversation in a mirror. There was no apology in her eyes, no hesitation, only resolve. Ethan's chest tightened. "We're married," he said quietly. This is when you stay." She shook her head. "I'm not throwing my life away. I've spent years trying to move forward. And now this." She gestured vaguely toward him, toward the hospital. "This changes everything." He wanted to argue, to plead, to remind her of vows spoken under sunlight and smiles, but the words refused to come. All he could feel was the crushing weight of realization. She had already mourned the marriage. He was just catching up. Lila glanced at her watch. "I have somewhere to be," she said. "The lawyers will handle the rest." She turned to leave, then paused. "I hope your treatment goes well," she added. The sentiment empty, obligatory. Then she walked away, heels echoing down the corridor, leaving Ethan standing alone with a folder he couldn't bring himself to open. People passed by, unaware they were witnessing the collapse of a life. Ethan slowly lowered himself onto a bench, his hands shaking now, control finally slipping. The hospital, once a place of potential hope, now felt like a courtroom where he had been sentenced twice in one day. What he didn't know, what Lila couldn't have known, was that this moment, this precise intersection of abandonment and vulnerability, would soon be exposed as the greatest miscalculation of her life. But for now, all Ethan knew was that he had cancer, no wife, and a future that looked terrifyingly empty. The official papers arrived 3 days later, delivered by a courier who avoided eye contact and spoke too softly, as if volume alone could soften the blow. Ethan signed where instructed, his hand steadier than he expected. Shock had a way of numbing everything else. Pain came later. He read the documents alone at the kitchen table, the same place where he and Lila once planned vacations and argued about paint colors. The language was clinical, efficient, stripped of emotion, irreconcilable differences. Equitable division, effective immediately. There was no mention of illness, no acknowledgement of timing. On paper, it looked clean, reasonable, almost civilized. In reality, it felt surgical. Lila had moved quickly, joint accounts frozen, her name removed from shared obligations. She had consulted lawyers before he had even finished his biopsy. Every step screamed preparation. This hadn't been an impulsive reaction to bad news. It was a plan executed at the first acceptable opportunity. The injustice settled in slowly, like a bruise darkening beneath the skin. Ethan's phone stayed quiet. Friends they once shared suddenly became distant. responses delayed, invitations withdrawn. He overheard fragments through social media, whispers disguised as concern. It's tragic. Really. She had to think about her future. You can't blame her for protecting herself. Protecting herself? The phrase echoed in his mind as he sat in waiting rooms for oncology consultations, alone, except for strangers who avoided conversation. He watched couples sit shoulder to shoulder, hands intertwined, and felt an unexpected envy, sharper than fear of treatment. He hadn't just lost a wife. He had lost his place beside someone. Leela, meanwhile, controlled the narrative effortlessly. She spoke of exhaustion, of emotional neglect, of years spent feeling invisible. She didn't lie outright. She didn't have to. She simply curated the truth until it resembled justification. By the time Ethan realized what was happening, opinions had already hardened. From his limited perspective, the cruelty wasn't loud. It was procedural, efficient. She had weaponized timing, legality, and social perception with precision. There were no screaming matches, no dramatic exits, just the quiet removal of support at the exact moment he needed it most. One afternoon, as Ethan sorted through medical bills, he found an old photo tucked into a drawer. It showed him and Lila on their honeymoon, sunburned and smiling, her head resting on his shoulder. He studied her expression, searching for signs he might have missed. Was the woman in the photo ever real, or had he projected meaning onto comfort, stability onto ambition? He placed the photo face down and closed the drawer. Chemotherapy began the following week. The first session was longer than he expected. Hours spent tethered to a machine that hummed softly, delivering poison meant to save him. He felt the side effects almost immediately. Nausea, fatigue, a strange metallic taste that wouldn't go away. Leela did not ask how it went. Instead, she emailed her lawyer, requesting expedited proceedings. She wanted it done quickly, cleanly. Before things became complicated, Ethan learned this accidentally, through a misdirected email, forwarded by a paralegal who quickly apologized. The message was brief, professional, chilling. Given the circumstances, my client wishes to finalize matters as soon as possible. Circumstances. He stared at the screen for a long time before closing his laptop. Something inside him shifted not into anger, but into clarity. He stopped expecting decency from someone who had already demonstrated her capacity for detachment. The days blurred together after that. Treatment, paperwork, silence. His body weakened, but his mind sharpened. In the absence of emotional noise, patterns became visible. He began to notice inconsistencies in Leela's timeline, small financial discrepancies, unexplained withdrawals, months before the diagnosis. At first, he dismissed the thoughts. Paranoia born from stress. But the more he reviewed bank statements, the more questions surfaced. She had been preparing long before his health failed. The divorce wasn't an escape from illness, it was an exit strategy, waiting for permission. The sense of injustice hardened into something quieter and more dangerous than rage. Ethan didn't confront her. He didn't call, didn't accuse, didn't plead. He followed instructions. He showed up where required. He signed where indicated. He allowed her to believe she had walked away unchallenged. And in doing so, he gave her exactly what she wanted, confidence. Lila interpreted his silence as weakness, as defeat. She mistook restraint for resignation, and that mistake settled deep, growing comfortable. What neither of them knew yet was that elsewhere, beyond hospital walls and legal offices, the foundation of this story was already shifting. A document filed decades earlier. A fortune accumulated quietly. A name written into a will by a man Ethan barely remembered. The injustice of this moment would not go unanswered. But for now, Ethan sat alone in his dim apartment, chemo port aching beneath his skin, divorce papers stacked neatly on the table, and the unsettling awareness that the worst betrayal of his life had arrived, disguised as efficiency. The day Leela moved out, she didn't say goodbye. Ethan came home from a chemotherapy session to find the apartment unnervingly quiet, not the peaceful kind of quiet, but the hollow kind, the kind that announced absence before the eyes could confirm it. Half the closet was empty. Her toiletries were gone from the bathroom. The framed wedding photo that once sat on the living room shelf had vanished, leaving behind a pale rectangle of dust where it used to be. She hadn't taken anything she didn't believe she deserved, which, as Ethan quickly realized, meant she had taken everything she could justify. What followed was not a dramatic collapse, but something colder. A slow erasure. Friends stopped calling. Invitations dried up. Messages went unanswered. When Ethan did see familiar names appear online, they were tagged in photos with Lila brunches, rooftop gatherings, smiling captions about new beginnings and choosing yourself. She looked lighter, freer, as if she had shed something heavy, as if that something had been him. From Ethan's limited perspective, it felt like being quietly voted out of a life he thought he still belonged to. No confrontation, no debate, just consensus formed in his absence. He overheard fragments when he ran into acquaintances at the grocery store or pharmacy, voices lowering, eyes filled with a mix of pity and judgment. It must have been hard for her. She did what she had to do. At least she didn't stay out of obligation. No one asked how he was holding up. No one questioned the timing. At night, the loneliness grew teeth. The apartment felt larger without her things, every room echoing with what was no longer there. Ethan slept on one side of the bed out of habit, his body still obeying rules that no longer applied. He woke, drenched in sweat, sometimes from nightmares about hospitals, sometimes from dreams where Lila was kind again, dreams that hurt more than the diagnosis. Bills arrived daily, medical expenses stacked neatly on the counter. Each envelope, another reminder that his body had become a liability. He reviewed his finances carefully, calculating how long he could survive if treatment ran long. The margin was thin, uncomfortable, but manageable. What hurt more than the money was the implication beneath it all, that he was now considered a losing investment. Leela's absence wasn't passive. She controlled the story with precision. Ethan learned this when his sister called one evening, her voice strained. "She says you checked out years ago," she said carefully. Emotionally, that she begged you to change. Ethan closed his eyes. "Did she mention the diagnosis?" he asked. A pause. "She said it confirmed what she already knew." Confirmed. The word echoed in his mind long after the call ended. Something about that conversation stayed with him. Not anger, confusion. The version of events Lila shared didn't align with the man Ethan believed himself to be. He began replaying memories, examining them from new angles. The nights he worked late, the times he chose silence over argument. The emotional labor he assumed was simply part of being dependable. Had he really disappeared, or had she simply stopped seeing value in what he offered? The question lingered as Ethan's physical strength waned. Chemotherapy stripped him down to essentials. Appetite faded, hair thinned, mirrors became enemies. But beneath the exhaustion, something else emerged, a clarity sharpened by loss. One afternoon, while organizing documents for his lawyer, Ethan noticed something small but odd, a series of withdrawals from their joint account months before his diagnosis. Not enough to trigger alarms, but enough to raise questions. At the time, he had assumed business expenses. Lila's projects always came with unpredictable costs. Now, the timing felt deliberate. He pulled older statements. Patterns emerged. Withdrawals aligning with weekends. He'd been traveling for work, transfers to accounts he didn't recognize. She hadn't drained the account, but she had prepared. Ethan leaned back in his chair, the room spinning slightly from fatigue. This wasn't abandonment born from panic. This was a controlled exit. She hadn't reacted to his illness. She had used it. The realization didn't ignite rage. It settled into something colder, something focused. For the first time since the diagnosis, Ethan stopped asking why she left and started asking how long she had planned to. He didn't confront her. He didn't tell anyone what he'd found. Instead, he documented everything quietly, filing statements into labeled folders. He took notes, dates, amounts, context. It felt oddly grounding, like reclaiming a sense of agency in a life that had spun beyond his control. Outside, Lila thrived. She posted photos from a weekend getaway, less than a month after moving out. New clothes, new circles, a man whose face appeared first in reflections, then gradually more openly. Comments poured in, support, praise, validation. Ethan watched none of it directly. He learned through screenshots sent by a well-meaning cousin, who quickly apologized afterward. "I thought you should know," she'd said. He did know. What Lila didn't realize was that every public smile widened the distance between her version of events and the truth. And distance, Ethan was learning, had a way of exposing inconsistencies. As his body weakened, his perception sharpened. He began to understand that betrayal didn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it arrived dressed as reason, as self-care, as inevitability. The unfairness of it all pressed down on him, not just the divorce, not just the illness, but the way the world had so easily accepted her justification. How quickly loyalty had been redefined as optional, compassion as conditional. Late one night, unable to sleep, Ethan sat at his desk. Surrounded by documents and dim light, he rested a hand over the port in his chest, feeling the dull ache beneath his skin. He didn't feel powerful. He didn't feel hopeful, but he felt awake. And somewhere deep beneath the exhaustion, the quiet resolve took shape. If this was how the world worked, if timing, perception, and preparation decided who was pitied and who was blamed, then he would learn to navigate those rules too. What he didn't know yet was that the ground beneath this entire story was already shifting, slowly but irrevocably. That the injustice he was enduring was buying him time. That silence, for now, was not surrender. It was preparation. The letter arrived without ceremony. Tucked between utility bills and hospital statements, its envelope thicker than the rest, and stamped with a law firm's insignia Ethan didn't recognize. It should have stood out. Under different circumstances, it would have. But chemo had a way of dulling everything. Senses, priorities, curiosity, survival. Narrowed the field of vision. Ethan placed it on the counter and forgot about it. Days passed, then weeks. Treatment schedules replaced calendars. Side effects dictated mornings. The mail became background noise, a ritual performed without attention. The envelope slid beneath a stack of papers, then beneath another. It waited patiently, the way truths often do when no one is ready to hear them. On a gray afternoon, rain tapping softly against the windows, Ethan searched for a receipt needed to submit an insurance appeal. He sifted through folders, moving slowly, careful not to trigger the dizziness that came and went without warning. His fingers brushed the edge of the thick envelope. He paused. The firm's name meant nothing to him. Old stone building downtown, he guessed. The kind that smelled like polish and paper. He considered setting it aside again. Whatever it was could wait. Everything felt like it could wait. But something, curiosity, or perhaps fatigue, loosening his habits, made him open it. Inside was a formal notice, printed on heavy cream paper, the language precise and unmistakably legal. He read the first line once, then again, then a third time, his heart beginning to pound. "Dear Mr. Ethan Cole," it began, "we regret to inform you of the passing of Mr. and quote, Henry Cole, and wish to extend our condolences." The name struck a distant chord. Henry Cole, a man he hadn't spoken to in over 20 years, a presence more myth than memory. Ethan sank into the chair, the room tilting slightly. He kept reading. "Pursuant to the terms of Mr. Cole's estate, you are hereby notified that you are the sole beneficiary of his holdings, subject to standard verification and probate proceedings." Sole beneficiary. Ethan's mouth went dry. The next page listed assets in careful, unemotional columns: equity holdings, private investments, real estate, trusts, figures that blurred together until they formed a single, impossible number: $1 billion. The world didn't explode. There was no cinematic swell of music, no sudden clarity, just silence. Heavy and disorienting, pressing in from all sides. Ethan stared at the page until the letters lost meaning. His hands trembled, not from chemo this time, but from something deeper, disbelief colliding with memory. Henry Cole had been his grandfather, a man of few words and sharper expectations. When Ethan was young, Henry had offered help, connections, opportunities, and mentorship. Ethan had declined, choosing a quieter life, one unentangled from a man known for ruthless business practices and colder personal standards. They parted on civil terms, but without warmth. Years passed, calls stopped, then birthdays, then everything. Ethan had assumed Henry's wealth, whatever it amounted to, would pass to someone else. There had been rumors of estrangement, of bridges burned. He had never asked. Pride, perhaps, or the belief that independence meant refusing inheritance. Now, the letter rewrote the past with brutal efficiency. He flipped through the remaining pages, absorbing conditions and timelines. The estate had been finalized months earlier. Notices sent, follow-ups attempted, emails, certified mail, phone calls. The firm had documented every effort. Ethan exhaled slowly, a bitter smile tugging at his lips. Of course he had missed them. He sat there for a long time, the rain intensifying outside, thoughts moving sluggishly. The money felt abstract, unreal, like a figure from a news headline rather than something connected to his life. Yet, beneath the disbelief, something else stirred a shift in gravity. Every interaction of the past months replayed itself through a new lens. Leela's timing, her confidence, her belief that she had secured the better end of the deal. She had left a man she believed was declining in health, in resources, in relevance. Ethan folded the letter carefully and placed it back into the envelope. His first instinct was not celebration, or revenge, or even relief. It was silence. He didn't call the firm immediately. He didn't tell his lawyer. He didn't tell anyone. He understood, instinctively, that knowledge changed behavior, that this information, once shared, would ripple outward, reshaping intentions and alliances. For the first time since his diagnosis, he felt something resembling control. That night, sleep came fitfully. Memories of Henry surfaced his stern gaze, the way he valued foresight above sentiment. The man had built empires quietly, rewarding patience and punishing impulse. Ethan wondered, not for the first time, whether the inheritance was less about blood and more about principle. In the days that followed, Ethan continued his routine unchanged. Treatments, paperwork, quiet meals alone. He responded to Lila's legal communications with the same restrained politeness as before. He allowed her to believe nothing had changed. Meanwhile, he read the letter again and again, absorbing details. There were stipulations, nothing unusual. Verification, discretion, time. The estate was vast, complex, and intentionally shielded from public scrutiny. Henry Cole had valued privacy as much as power. Ethan understood that this inheritance wasn't just money. It was leverage, it was protection, it was a test. He began to see the cruel symmetry of it all. The day his life seemed to collapse, diagnosis, divorce, abandonment had been the same day. His future quietly expanded beyond imagination. Two truths, moving in opposite directions, intersecting at his lowest point. Lila had walked away, believing she had escaped a sinking ship. She had no idea she had stepped off moments before it transformed. Ethan folded the letter once more and placed it in a secure folder. Locking it away, there would be time for calls, for meetings, for strategy. For now, he returned to the window and watched the rain fall, a calm settling over him that hadn't been there before. The injustice of the past months didn't disappear, but it shifted and reframed as a prelude rather than a conclusion. He was still sick, still alone, still underestimated, but he was no longer powerless, and that, he realized, changed everything. The treatments grew heavier as winter crept in, the days shortening until darkness seemed permanent. Ethan's body responded the way bodies do when pushed beyond their limits, hair falling out in clumps, appetite fading to obligation, muscles weakening no matter how much he tried to move. There were mornings when standing felt like negotiation, when the simple act of showering left him breathless. This was the part no one romanticized. He learned quickly that illness didn't arrive all at once. It came in layers. Physical pain was only the beginning. There was the humiliation of dependency, the erosion of identity, the way people spoke to him more slowly, more carefully, as if fragility were contagious. Nurses were kind, doctors were efficient, strangers avoided eye contact, and Leela was gone. Ethan spent long hours alone, wrapped in blankets on the couch, the television flickering silently. He no longer watched shows. He watched time pass. Each hour was something to endure rather than fill. There were moments, quiet, dangerous moments, when surrender felt easier than hope, when he wondered whether continuing treatment was bravery or stubbornness, whether survival was worth rebuilding a life stripped of meaning. Those thoughts frightened him more than the diagnosis. The letter stayed locked away in a drawer, untouched. Its existence was a quiet anchor, something solid beneath the chaos. But he resisted the urge to draw strength from it prematurely. Money didn't cure cancer. It didn't bring back trust. It didn't fill an empty apartment. If anything, its presence sharpened the loneliness. There was no one to share it with, no partner to call, no family to celebrate with. Wealth, in isolation, felt strangely hollow. One night, after a particularly brutal session, Ethan collapsed onto the floor of the bathroom, his body betraying him completely. Nausea overtook him, leaving him trembling against cold tile. He stayed there longer than necessary, not because he couldn't move, but because he didn't see the point. Eventually, he forced himself up, gripping the sink, until his knuckles whitened. His reflection startled him. Sunken eyes, pallid skin, a man reduced. He didn't recognize himself, and yet, beneath the physical decay, something else stared back. A quiet resilience, bruised but intact. That was the night he decided not to die quietly. The decision wasn't dramatic. There was no vow whispered into the dark, no triumphant music swelling in his chest. It was a practical choice. Grounded in exhaustion, he was tired of losing things without consent, tired of being acted upon rather than acting. The next morning, he organized his life the way he once organized data, methodically, unemotionally. He set alarms for medication, created meal plans he could tolerate, scheduled physical therapy sessions to rebuild strength. However slowly, he also began writing. At first, it was just notes, observations about his mood, physical symptoms. But gradually, the entries shifted. He wrote about the marriage not with anger, but with curiosity. He documented moments he had dismissed at the time, patterns, inconsistencies, decisions that now made sense in hindsight. The act of writing gave shape to chaos. It returned narrative control to him. During treatment sessions, as medication dripped into his veins, Ethan watched other patients. He listened to fragments of conversations, stories of spouses who stayed, children who rotated shifts, friends who showed up uninvited. He felt envy, yes, but also perspective. Suffering, he learned, didn't grant virtue or fairness. It simply revealed what was already there. In quiet moments, he allowed himself to imagine a future beyond survival, not a grand one, a modest one. Health, peace, autonomy. He pictured a version of himself no longer defined by what had been taken. That version didn't include Lila. The realization came without bitterness. She had been a chapter, not the book, a structure built on imbalance, destined to collapse once tested. Accepting that truth felt less like defeat and more like clarity. Meanwhile, Lila's life continued loudly, if distantly. Ethan learned through indirect channels that she had moved in with someone new, that she spoke openly about finally choosing happiness, that she framed her departure as an act of courage. Ethan felt no urge to correct her. Let the story stand. Let her believe it. Strength returned slowly, almost imperceptibly. A few extra steps each day, less dizziness, a stronger grip. Progress measured in inches, but progress nonetheless. With strength came patience. One afternoon, as snow dusted the windowsill, Ethan retrieved the letter from the drawer. He read it again, this time without shock. The words settled differently now. Not as salvation, but as responsibility. Henry Cole had built something massive and left it to a grandson who had chosen obscurity over power. The irony wasn't lost on him, nor was the lesson. Ethan realized then that the inheritance wasn't meant to fix his pain. It was meant to test his judgment, to see what he would do when given options he had once rejected. He placed the letter back in its folder and locked it away again. He wasn't ready to use it yet. There was still work to do internally, quietly, invisibly. Healing that had nothing to do with medicine or money. Healing rooted in dignity, boundaries, and the courage to rebuild without bitterness. At rock bottom, Ethan had discovered something unexpected. Not rage, not revenge, but resolve. And resolve, he was learning, was far more dangerous. The lawyer found him not through email or voicemail, but in person. Ethan had just finished a shortened chemotherapy session when a woman in a charcoal gray coat approached him in the clinic lobby. She moved with quiet confidence, the kind that didn't ask for attention but commanded it anyway. When she said his name, there was no uncertainty in her voice. "Mr. Cole," she said, "I'm Mara Whitfield. I represent the Henry Cole estate." For a moment, Ethan wondered if exhaustion was playing tricks on him. He nodded slowly, his body still heavy from treatment. "I received a letter," he said. "I haven't responded yet." "I know," Mara replied. "That's why I'm here." They sat in a small conference room off the lobby. Glass walls frosted just enough to suggest privacy, without fully granting it. Mara placed a slim leather folder on the table, but didn't open it immediately. Instead, she studied Ethan with professional curiosity, not pity. It was refreshing. "My client anticipated you might not respond quickly," she said. "He planned for contingencies." Ethan's pulse quickened at the mention of Henry. "I didn't think he remembered me," he admitted. Mara allowed herself a small smile. "On the contrary, he watched you for years." She opened the folder and slid a document toward him. It wasn't financial. It was personal correspondence, notes, handwritten observations. Henry Cole's handwriting was sharp, decisive. "He admired that you refused his help," Mara continued, "not because you rejected him, but because you chose independence when it cost you comfort. He believed restraint was rarer than ambition." Ethan swallowed hard. He hadn't known that, hadn't imagined his quiet choices were ever noticed. "The estate is substantial," Mara said, her tone shifting to formality. "But it's also complex. It's been structured to protect you from public exposure, from opportunists, from legal exploitation. Your name has been shielded deliberately." Ethan nodded. "And the conditions? Standard, for the most part. Discretion, during the transition period. No public disclosure until assets are consolidated. And one personal clause." She paused. "Your grandfather wanted to be sure you wouldn't act impulsively." Ethan almost laughed. If only Henry knew how little impulse he had left. Mara closed the folder. "Before we proceed, I need to ask you something directly. Are you currently involved in any legal disputes that could complicate the transfer?" Ethan hesitated for a fraction of a second. "A divorce?" he said. "Recently filed." Mara's expression didn't change, but her eyes sharpened. "Has your spouse been informed of this inheritance?" "No." "Good," she said simply. That single word carried weight. Over the next hour, Mara explained the process. Timelines, teams, safeguards. The scale of it all was overwhelming, but Ethan listened carefully, asking precise questions when needed. He wasn't dazzled by numbers. He was thinking several steps ahead. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair. fatigue creeping in. "I don't want to change anything yet," he said. "I want time." Mara nodded. That was also anticipated. As she stood to leave, she paused. "One more thing. Given your health, we can accelerate certain protections if needed." Ethan met her gaze. "I'm not going anywhere," he said quietly. She studied him for a moment, then smiled. "I believe you." After she left, Ethan remained seated, the room humming faintly around him. The inheritance felt more real now, not as an abstract promise, but as a structure already moving into place. For the first time, he understood that power didn't announce itself, it organized quietly. That night, he reviewed his divorce documents with new eyes. The settlement terms were lopsided, but not final. Lila had pushed for speed, not thoroughness. She had assumed there was nothing left to uncover. Ethan realized then that the greatest advantage he had wasn't money. It was time. He began making small changes, none of them visible from the outside. He consulted a different attorney, one recommended discreetly by Mara. He asked questions about disclosure obligations, about revisions, about what constituted material change. He did not mention the inheritance. Instead, he listened. As days turned into weeks, Ethan's health stabilized. Not cured, not restored, but steady. The fog in his mind lifted just enough for strategy to take root. He reviewed financial records again, this time with professional guidance. The patterns he'd noticed before sharpened into evidence. Lila's withdrawals weren't illegal, but they were strategic. Timing mattered, intent mattered. Ethan didn't rush to confront her. He didn't feel the need to reclaim dignity through dramatic gestures. He understood now that dignity came from control, not confrontation. Occasionally, messages from Lila's lawyer arrived impatient, increasingly curt. She wanted closure. She wanted her future unencumbered. Ethan responded politely, slowly. Every delay frustrated her. He could sense it in the tone shifts, the passive aggression creeping into formal language. She had expected him to fade quietly, to comply, to disappear. Instead, he remained, calm, methodical, unmoved. One evening, as Ethan sat at his desk, reviewing notes, he caught himself smiling not with joy, but with recognition. The power dynamic had already shifted, and Lila didn't even know it yet. He wasn't planning revenge. He wasn't interested in humiliation. He was interested in truth. And soon enough, the truth would have consequences. Ethan chose silence deliberately. Not the hollow silence of defeat, but the kind that forces others to reveal themselves. He had learned, through illness and abandonment, that people filled quiet with assumptions. They projected certainty where none existed, and in those projections, they exposed intent. He continued to move through his days exactly as before. Chemotherapy appointments, paperwork, short walks when his strength allowed. He answered legal emails with polite restraint, never volunteering information, never pushing back aggressively. To an outside observer, he looked like a man conserving what little energy he had left. That illusion worked in his favor. Behind the scenes, Ethan's world grew larger. His new attorney, discreet and unassuming, met with him in offices that valued privacy over grandeur. Together, they reviewed the divorce timeline in detail, dates, financial moves, correspondence, everything was reconstructed into a clear sequence of decisions. The picture that emerged was unsettling, but consistent. Lila had begun untangling herself months before the diagnosis. She had redirected funds quietly, consulted legal counsel under the guise of future planning, and reduced her visible reliance on shared assets. When the diagnosis arrived, it hadn't frightened her. It had given her cover. From Ethan's limited perspective, the realization was both painful and clarifying. The illness hadn't ended the marriage. It had simply exposed its expiration date. At his attorney's suggestion, Ethan authorized a deeper review of their financial history. Nothing invasive, nothing illegal, just a careful examination of patterns. What they found wasn't criminal, but it was damning. Emails that suggested emotional detachment long before she admitted it publicly, calendar entries that placed her with someone else during times she claimed to be working late, messages that hinted at resentment framed as empowerment. And then there was the affair. It surfaced not through dramatic confession, but through data. Hotel receipts charged to a personal account during weekends Ethan was traveling, a recurring number saved under a different name, photos stored and deleted, but not fully erased. Ethan stared at the evidence longer than necessary, waiting for the emotional impact to arrive. It didn't. Instead, he felt a strange sense of relief. Betrayal, when confirmed, lost its power to confuse. It became a fact, a closed equation. He instructed his attorney not to act on the information yet. "Let her continue," he said calmly. "She believes this is over, outside." Lila thrived under that belief. She moved confidently through her new life. Unburdened by guilt or doubt, she spoke openly about reinvention and choosing joy. The man beside her, confident, visible, eager to be seen, fit neatly into her narrative. Together, they presented a future untainted by compromise. Ethan watched none of it directly. He didn't need to. The fragments that reached him were enough. Each one confirmed the same thing. Lila had no reason to suspect anything had changed. Silence, he realized, wasn't just absence, it was misdirection. During one particularly exhausting week, Ethan's attorney asked him a question that lingered long after the meeting ended. "What do you want the outcome to be?" Ethan didn't answer immediately. He considered revenge, briefly. The way one considers a sharp object, not to use it, but to acknowledge its existence. He thought of public exposure, of legal pressure, of watching Lila scramble. Then he thought of the man he had been before all of this. Quiet, principled, resistant to spectacle. "I want fairness," he said finally. "And I want distance." His attorney nodded. "Then patience will serve you well." As his strength continued to return in small increments, Ethan focused on discipline. Emotional restraint had once been a survival mechanism. Now, it was strategy. He stopped checking social media entirely. He limited conversations to what was necessary. He allowed others to underestimate him. There was power in being overlooked. Behind closed doors, preparations continued. The inheritance remained undisclosed, but its structure was already shielding him. Trusts established, assets consolidated, names protected. By design, nothing tied him publicly to the fortune yet. Mara Whitfield checked in periodically. Always brief, always precise. "Everything is proceeding as planned," she would say. No disruptions. Ethan appreciated her efficiency. He also appreciated that she didn't ask him how he felt. Feelings were no longer the point. The divorce proceedings slowed to a crawl, much to Lila's frustration. Her messages grew sharper. Her lawyer's tone shifted from confident to irritated. She had expected a quick resolution, closure, control. Instead, she encountered resistance without confrontation, delay without explanation. Ethan understood her impatience. It mirrored her character. She moved forward by cutting loose ends. He was becoming one. One afternoon, as Ethan sat in a cafe near the oncology center, sipping tea he barely tasted, he noticed something else. Peace. Not happiness. Not relief. But a steady calm that hadn't existed in months. The silence he maintained externally had created space internally. He no longer replayed conversations. He no longer wondered what he could have done differently. The narrative had clarified itself, and clarity was oddly comforting. Ethan wasn't plotting destruction. He was allowing consequences to form naturally, guided by truth rather than emotion. Lila had made choices under assumptions. Those assumptions were false, and when false assumptions met reality, the collision was inevitable. For now, Ethan remained still. The silence continued, and with every passing day, it grew louder. Lila believed she had stepped into her winning chapter. From the outside, her life appeared carefully, curated brunches bathed in natural light, weekend getaways framed by panoramic views, captions that spoke of freedom and growth. She wore brighter colors now, laughed louder, and spoke often about finally choosing herself. The people around her nodded approvingly. Reinvention was admired. Leaving was reframed as courage. The man beside her fit seamlessly into the picture. He was attentive in public, confident without being subtle, the kind who filled silence quickly. He liked being seen with her. Leela liked that he didn't need convincing. Their relationship moved fast, fueled by the shared belief that the past had been a necessary shedding. What she didn't realize was how loudly she advertised certainty. Every decision she made assumed finality. She furnished a new place without hesitation. She spoke about the divorce as if it were already resolved. She planned months ahead, financially and socially, as though nothing could disrupt the trajectory she had chosen. Ethan noticed these things indirectly, through timelines and tone rather than pictures. The legal correspondence revealed more than any photograph could. Her impatience bled through formal language now. Requests were followed by follow-ups. Politeness thinned into demand. She wanted closure because closure meant control. Her lawyer pushed for dates, for signatures, for expedited rulings. Given the circumstances, the emails read, "My client wishes to move forward without unnecessary delay." Ethan read them calmly and responded with measured courtesy. He requested clarifications, asked for additional documentation, suggested reasonable extensions. Nothing confrontational, nothing dramatic, just enough resistance to unsettle. Lila interpreted the delays as incompetence or perhaps desperation in her mind. Ethan was a man clinging to the remnants of a life that had already moved on. She spoke of him that way now, past tense, diminished, unfortunate. He's not well. She told friends, this is probably just hard for him. They agreed. Sympathy flowed easily when it didn't require responsibility. Meanwhile, Ethan's life expanded quietly. His health stabilized further, energy returning in cautious waves. He began to take longer walks, to read again, to think beyond the next appointment. The apartment felt less like a holding cell and more like a workspace. He reviewed the financial structures, taking shape around him, trusts nested within trusts. Layers of insulation designed to keep noise out and intention intact. The fortune moved silently, like tectonic plates shifting beneath the surface. Nothing about it demanded his attention daily. That was the point. Ethan learned to appreciate the contrast between visibility and power. Lila's life required witnesses. His required discretion. One afternoon, as he met with his attorney, a question surfaced again, this time framed differently. At some point, she said, she will realize something isn't aligning. Are you prepared for that? Ethan considered it. I'm prepared to stay consistent, he replied. Consistency, he had learned, was destabilizing to people who relied on momentum. Lila began to sense resistance without understanding its source. The divorce, which she had expected to finalize smoothly, lingered unresolved. Small issues surfaced, asset valuations questioned, timelines adjusted, nothing alarming in isolation. Together, they formed friction. She grew irritable, snapped at her lawyer, complained about delays. He's doing this on purpose, she said once. Pacing her living room, he's trying to punish me. The accusation was revealing. Punishment implied intention. Ethan had offered none. He was simply insisting on accuracy. At night, Lila scrolled through old photos, not with nostalgia but irritation. Ethan's face appeared thinner, paler, yet composed. She wondered briefly why he hadn't reached out, why he hadn't begged, or lashed out, or collapsed the way she had expected. The absence of reaction unsettled her. She compensated by leaning further into her new identity. More events, louder declarations, bigger plans. She talked about investments, about lifestyle upgrades, about what came next. Confidence, after all, was something you could perform until it became real. But confidence built on assumptions was fragile. Ethan remained deliberately ordinary in public spaces. No upgrades, No announcements. He moved through the world unnoticed, exactly as he preferred. Underestimation followed him like a shadow, and he welcomed it. One evening, he received an unexpected message, not from Lila, but from someone in her circle, an acquaintance, cautious and awkward, checking in. "Hope you're doing okay," it read. "It's been a lot," Ethan replied politely, briefly. The response came minutes later. "You seem surprisingly calm." He smiled faintly at the screen. Calm, he knew, was often mistaken for surrender by those who equated volume with strength. As weeks passed, the imbalance between Lila's certainty and Ethan's composure widened. She began to feel it in subtle ways, in the lack of closure, in the unanswered questions, in the sense that something had shifted beyond her line of sight. Still, she dismissed the feeling. She had moved on. She had won. Ethan allowed her that belief. Because the most effective reversals weren't announced, they unfolded. The turning point didn't arrive with a dramatic revelation. It arrived as a calendar invite. Ethan received it on a quiet Tuesday morning, sandwiched between a physical therapy session and a follow-up scan. A preliminary settlement conference had been scheduled, routine, procedural, unremarkable. Lila's lawyer had pushed for it. Ethan's had agreed, with conditions. What Lila didn't know was that the board had already been set. In the weeks leading up to the conference, Ethan's attorney assembled a team with deliberate restraint. No flashy names, no firms that announced themselves with marble lobbies and press mentions. These were specialists, people who understood timing, disclosure thresholds, and leverage without spectacle. They spoke in hypotheticals and contingencies. They preferred questions to declarations. Ethan listened more than he spoke. They mapped the divorce like a chessboard, identifying pressure points and blind spots. Lila's urgency, her assumptions, the way she conflated speed with strength, every move she made revealed how confident she was that there was nothing left to uncover. That confidence was useful. Financial records were revisited with forensic patience. The earlier withdrawals were contextualized, not as crimes, but as indicators of intent. Communications were aligned against timelines, revealing discrepancies between public narrative and private action. Nothing explosive on its own. Together, they formed a pattern. Patterns mattered. Ethan learned that in legal spaces, tone often carried more weight than accusation. So they crafted responses that sounded cooperative while quietly reshaping the field. Requests for clarification became requests for documentation. Deadlines became flexible. Valuations were re-examined. Each adjustment slowed the process just enough to destabilize Lila's expectations. Her lawyer grew sharper in correspondence. Subtle threats crept in, suggestions of unnecessary complications, hints at reputational exposure. Ethan's attorney responded calmly, referencing statutes and precedents, offering neutral explanations. The effect was cumulative. By the time the settlement conference approached, Lila was already agitated. She arrived early, dressed impeccably, her posture rigid with resolve. She believed she was there to finalize, to close a chapter. Ethan arrived quietly, accompanied by his attorney. He looked healthier than she expected, still thinner, still pale, but upright, composed, present. The room was neutral, designed to minimize emotion. A long table, water pitchers, soft lighting. Lila avoided looking at Ethan directly. When she did, she found no resentment waiting for her. That unsettled her more than anger would have. The discussion began with formalities, positions restated, timelines reviewed. Lila's lawyer pushed for expedited resolution, emphasizing her client's desire to move forward. Ethan's attorney nodded. "We share that goal," she said, "which is why accuracy is essential." She slid a folder across the table. Inside were documents Lila had not anticipated, seeing bank statements aligned with travel records, communications juxtaposed against calendar entries. No accusations were made, no conclusions drawn. The evidence was presented as context. Lila's lawyer frowned. "What is the relevance of this?" To equitable division, Ethan's attorney replied evenly. And to intent. Lila's composure cracked just slightly. This is unnecessary, she said. We've already agreed on. Agreements assume transparency. The attorney interrupted gently. We're ensuring that standard is met. The mediator leaned forward, interested now. The conversation shifted. Lila's certainty faltered as questions multiplied. Why had certain transfers occurred when they did? Why were explanations inconsistent? Why had certain assets been excluded from preliminary disclosures? None of the questions accused her of wrongdoing. They didn't need to. Lila glanced at Ethan for the first time, searching his face for something: anger, desperation, triumph. She found none. He sat with his hands folded, listening. The absence of reaction unnerved her. As the meeting progressed, it became clear that the process would not conclude that day. Additional reviews were recommended, timelines extended. Lila's lawyer requested a private sidebar, his voice tight with concern. When they returned, the tone had changed. We'll need time to address these points, he said. Ethan nodded once. Of course, end quote. Outside the room, Lila confronted him in the hallway, her voice low but sharp. What are you doing? Following procedure, he replied calmly. This isn't necessary, she said. We could be done. Accuracy takes time, he repeated, her eyes narrowed. You think you're being clever? Ethan met her gaze. I think I'm being thorough. She scoffed and walked away, heels striking the floor with irritation. That evening, Ethan returned home, exhausted but steady. The meeting hadn't given him satisfaction. It had given him confirmation. Lila was no longer in control. In the days that followed, her behavior grew erratic. Messages sent late at night, sudden reversals, attempts to renegotiate terms she had previously insisted on. The confidence that once fueled her decisions now worked against her, revealing impatience and fear. Ethan did not respond emotionally. He allowed his attorney to handle communication. He focused on his health, his routines, the quiet rebuilding of his strength. Behind the scenes, the inheritance infrastructure completed another layer of insulation. Accounts finalized, holdings transferred, all without noise, all without urgency. The chessboard had shifted. Lila had made her moves early, believing the game was simple. Ethan had waited, understanding that complexity favored patience. And now, with every procedural step, the distance between their assumptions and reality widened. The end was no longer a question of if. It was a matter of when. The meeting took place on a morning so ordinary, it felt almost disrespectful to the tension it carried. Gray sky, mild traffic, coffee cooling untouched on the table. Ethan arrived early, as he always did now, preferring stillness to anticipation. He sat alone in the conference room, hands folded, breathing slow and measured. This time, Lila was late. When she finally entered, the confidence she once wore so easily felt forced. Her smile was tight, her movements slightly too sharp. She greeted the room quickly, avoiding Ethan's eyes until the last possible second. When their gazes met, she searched his face again for weakness, for guilt, and for reaction. She found none. The mediator began with formalities, but the atmosphere was already charged. The previous conference had unsettled Lila more than she cared to admit. Since then, questions had multiplied. Requests for documentation had expanded. What she believed would be a formality had become an examination. Ethan listened as positions were restated. Lila's lawyer spoke more cautiously now, his language precise, defensive. He emphasized cooperation, fairness, the desire to resolve matters efficiently. Ethan's attorney responded evenly, her tone unchanged. We share that goal, she said, which is why we'd like to clarify a few outstanding issues. She placed a thin folder on the table. Lila's jaw tightened. This time, the documents went deeper. Not just timelines and statements, but analysis patterns presented cleanly, neutrally, without accusation, The narrative Lila had relied on began to fray under its own contradictions. The mediator asked questions. Clarifications were requested. Silence stretched. Finally, Lila spoke. "This is unnecessary," she said sharply. "None of this changes the outcome." Ethan looked at her then, really looked at her. "For the first time in weeks, it changes the understanding," he said quietly. The room stilled. Lila blinked, surprised by his voice. "What? You wanted this to be quick," Ethan continued, his tone calm, controlled. "You wanted it clean, so did I. But clean requires honesty." Her eyes flashed. "Are you accusing me of something?" "No," he replied. "I'm asking for accuracy. The distinction mattered." Lila laughed, a short, humorless sound. "You think dragging this out gives you leverage?" Ethan paused, choosing his words carefully. "I think assumptions do." The mediator intervened, steering the conversation back to process. But the damage was done. The balance in the room had shifted. Lila felt it. Everyone did. As the meeting progressed, it became clear that Lila's original position was no longer tenable. Concessions were suggested, revisions proposed. The finality she had counted on dissolved into contingency. When the session ended, there was no resolution, only an agreement to reconvene. Outside the room, Lila confronted Ethan again, her composure cracking at the edges. "What do you want?" she demanded. Ethan met her gaze steadily. "Fairness." "You already have that," she snapped. "Do I?" he asked. She hesitated. For the first time, doubt flickered openly across her face. That doubt followed her home. In the days that followed, Lila unraveled quietly. She replayed conversations, scrutinized emails, searched for explanations that fit her expectations. None did. Ethan's behavior didn't align with weakness or desperation. It aligned with preparation. She began to suspect there was something she didn't know. Her lawyer hinted as much during a tense phone call. "There may be factors we're not seeing," he said carefully. "What factors?" she pressed. "I don't know yet," he admitted. "But he's not acting like someone with nothing to lose." The statement lodged in her mind like a splinter. Meanwhile, Ethan remained steady. He felt no triumph, no satisfaction, only a quiet certainty that the truth was moving closer to the surface. He continued his routines, continued his treatment, continued letting others underestimate him. One evening, as he reviewed notes with his attorney, she looked up from her screen. "If she pushes harder," she said, "we may need to reveal more than she expects." Ethan considered this. "Not yet," he said. Let her push. Pressure, he had learned, revealed character. Lila pushed. She demanded faster timelines, threatened escalation, floated the idea of public narrative shifts. Each move was louder than the last. Driven by the growing fear that control was slipping through her fingers, Ethan responded to none of it directly. The next meeting was scheduled sooner than expected. This time, Lila arrived early. She watched Ethan enter, her gaze sharper, more cautious. She studied his posture, his expression, searching for signs she might have missed. When he sat down, she spoke before anyone else could. "What aren't you telling me?" she asked. The room froze. Ethan looked at her calmly. "That's not how this works." Her breath caught. The mediator cleared his throat, redirecting the conversation. But the question lingered, unanswered and heavy. As the session unfolded, Lila's confidence fractured completely. The narrative she had built of escape, of victory, of clean endings collapsed under the weight of uncertainty. She realized then that she had misjudged the moment she walked away, that she had mistaken silence for surrender, and for the first time since filing for divorce, Lila understood something deeply unsettling. Ethan had never been behind, he had simply been waiting. The collapse didn't happen all at once. It arrived in increments, each one small enough to deny, each one sharp enough to wound. Lila first felt it when her lawyer stopped returning calls immediately. Messages that once took minutes now took hours. then days. When they finally spoke, his tone was careful in a way that made her stomach tighten. "We need to be realistic," he said. "Your position isn't as strong as we believed." She laughed it off at first. "You said this was straightforward." "It was," he replied. "Based on the information we had, the implication hung between them." The next meeting confirmed her fear. What had once been framed as procedural delays now revealed substance. Asset reviews widened. Assumptions were questioned. Her previous certainty that speed guaranteed victory crumbled under scrutiny. The mediator's demeanor shifted as well. Where once there had been deference to her urgency, there was now neutrality, distance. The room no longer leaned her way. Ethan noticed everything. He noticed the way Lila's hands trembled when documents were presented, the way her confidence faltered when timelines didn't align with her explanations. He noticed how often she spoke now, filling silence that once belonged to her certainty. The evidence wasn't sensational. That was its power. There were no accusations of crime, no dramatic reveals, just facts placed side by side, revealing intent through pattern. Funds moved before they were discussed, commitments made before justifications existed, a life exited before it officially ended. Each fact tightened the net. Lila's narrative of being blindsided, of enduring neglect, of choosing survival no longer stood alone. It competed with records, with consistency, with timing, and timing was unforgiving. When her lawyer requested a private meeting, she expected reassurance. Instead, she received warning. "If this continues," he said carefully, "we risk unfavorable findings, not just financially." Her pulse spiked. "Are you threatening me?" "I'm advising you," he corrected. "We need to adjust expectations." Adjust expectations. The phrase echoed painfully. Leela had built her future on expectations of freedom, of elevation, of winning cleanly. Now those expectations were being revised downward. She began to bargain. Concessions were offered, terms softened. The urgency that once worked in her favor now betrayed desperation. She wanted closure again, but now closure meant minimizing damage rather than celebrating escape. Ethan's attorney listened, considered, responded with measured calm. Fairness, she reminded them, was the goal. Outside the conference room, whispers followed Lila for the first time. Not gossip, concern. Subtle shifts in tone from acquaintances who sensed something changing. Invitations slowed. Curiosity replaced admiration. The story she had curated began to unravel, not because of exposure, but because of inconsistency. Ethan never corrected the narrative publicly. He didn't need to. Truth had a way of asserting itself when pressure was applied evenly and without emotion. The final meeting arrived without ceremony. Lila sat across the table, shoulders tense, eyes tired. She no longer looked victorious. She looked cornered by reality. The terms presented were not cruel. They were balanced. But they were far from what she had expected months earlier. Assets reassessed, claims adjusted, privileges she assumed were guaranteed now, required justification. She glanced at Ethan one last time, searching again for emotion. "Was this always your plan?" she asked quietly. Ethan considered the question. "No," he said. "This was always the truth." Her breath hitched. For a moment, something like regret surfaced, but it vanished quickly, replaced by self-preservation. She nodded stiffly and signed. The moment the pen left the page, something fundamental shifted. The divorce was finalized, but the cost extended beyond paperwork. In the weeks that followed, Lila's life constricted, financial flexibility tightened. Plans were revised. The man who had stood beside her, so confidently, began to distance himself as the glow of certainty faded. Opportunities she had spoken of so boldly became conditional, then unavailable. Power, she learned too late, attracted loyalty only when it appeared stable. Ethan watched none of this directly. He didn't need to. His focus had already moved forward. His health continued to improve. His routine solidified. His future, Once a narrow corridor defined by illness and loss opened quietly. The inheritance finalized in the background, its machinery complete, trusts settled, protections in place, no announcements, no headlines, just reality. One afternoon, as Ethan walked through a park near his apartment, the winter air sharp but clean, he felt something unfamiliar settle into his chest. Relief. Not the relief of revenge, but the relief of alignment, of knowing that the world, for once, had balanced itself without him needing to force it. Lila had not been destroyed. She had been revealed. And in that revelation, she paid exactly what her choices demanded, no more, no less. Ethan sat on a bench, breathing deeply, feeling the steady rhythm of a body that was learning how to live again. The chapter had closed, not with fireworks, but with justice. Healing did not arrive with victory. It came quietly, in the absence of conflict. Once the divorce was finalized, Ethan expected something dramatic to fill the space it left behind. Anger, triumph, grief delayed. Instead, there was stillness, the kind that initially felt unsettling, as if the world were holding its breath. Then, slowly, that stillness softened into peace. His health continued its gradual climb. Treatments became less frequent. Scans brought cautious optimism. The word remission wasn't spoken yet, but possibility entered the conversation. Tentative and respectful, Ethan learned not to rush hope. He had rushed once before, and it had cost him. He began attending a small support group at the oncology center, not because he needed answers, but because he wanted to listen. There were stories heavier than his, lighter than his, all bound by the same thread of vulnerability. He spoke when invited, honestly but without bitterness. The act of sharing, he discovered, didn't reopen wounds. It confirmed their healing. Outside the clinic, his life simplified. He sold what he didn't need, cleared closets, donated furniture that carried too many memories. The apartment transformed not into something new, but into something intentional. Every object earned its place. The inheritance remained largely untouched. It existed as structure rather than indulgence. Ethan resisted the urge to upgrade his life overnight. He had learned what sudden elevation attracted. Instead, he focused on stability investments aligned with his values, philanthropic interests that spoke quietly rather than loudly. Mara Whitfield checked in periodically, offering updates. Never pressure. She understood now that Ethan's restraint wasn't hesitation. It was discernment. One afternoon, she asked him, "Do you ever think about telling her?" Ethan knew who she meant. "No," he said simply. Not because he feared confrontation, but because it no longer served a purpose. The truth had done its work without announcement. Lila faded from his daily awareness. Occasionally, a name surfaced in conversation, a memory stirred by an old place, but the emotional charge was gone. She had become what she always was, a chapter, not the story. Ethan began volunteering with a cancer advocacy organization, offering behind-the-scenes support rather than public presence. He helped streamline processes, fund research quietly, improve patient access. He understood systems now. He knew how much difference invisible efficiency could make. For the first time in years, he felt aligned with himself. He also began seeing a therapist, not out of crisis, but curiosity. He wanted to understand why he had mistaken endurance for love, silence for safety. The work was uncomfortable, necessary. He learned that boundaries weren't walls, they were definitions. As spring approached, Ethan's walks grew longer. The city felt different, less oppressive, more navigable. He noticed small things again, the sound of leaves, the rhythm of foot traffic, the way sunlight filtered through glass. Life, he realized, had been waiting for him to arrive fully. One evening, as he prepared dinner in his quiet kitchen, his phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. He let it ring once, twice, then answered. "Ethan," a voice said hesitantly. He recognized it immediately. "I won't keep you," Lila continued. I wanted to say I'm sorry for how things ended." There was no anger in her voice, No manipulation, just weariness. Ethan listened, his expression unchanged. "I hope you find what you're looking for," he replied gently. There was a pause. "You too," she said. The call ended. Ethan set the phone down and returned to cooking, the moment passing without disturbance. Forgiveness, he realized, didn't require reconciliation. It required release. Later that night, he sat by the window, watching the city lights blur into constellations. He thought of the man he had been: quiet, compliant, invisible. He thought of the man he was becoming: measured, grounded, present. The journey had cost him nearly everything, but it had given him himself. Healing, he learned, wasn't about restoring the past. It was about building a future that no longer needed to escape from its own reflection. And, for the first time, that future felt real. Ethan never announced the moment his life truly changed. There was no ribbon-cutting ceremony, no dramatic reveal, no public declaration of rebirth. The shift happened quietly, in the accumulation of ordinary days that no longer felt heavy, days that didn't require survival tactics, days that simply existed. His doctors finally used the word remission in careful tones, emphasizing caution, follow-ups, patience. Ethan nodded, grateful but grounded. He had learned that certainty was a luxury, not a right. Health, like trust, was something you maintained, not assumed. With his body stronger, his mind followed. He began traveling again, not extravagantly, not for escape, but for perspective. Small towns, long walks, anonymous cafes where no one knew his past. He enjoyed being unseen, not because he felt small, but because he no longer needed validation. The inheritance moved fully into place, its presence solid but unobtrusive. Ethan structured it the way he structured his life now: layered, protected, purposeful. He funded research quietly, invested in projects that valued longevity over attention, supported people and systems without attaching his name. Wealth, he realized, was not what you displayed, it was what you enabled. Occasionally, he encountered people who reminded him of who he once was: driven, anxious, seeking approval from those who offered conditional affection. He listened more than he advised. Some lessons had to be lived, not explained. Lila became a distant memory, resurfacing only when contrast was needed. He didn't wish her harm. He didn't wish her well either. She existed now as a reminder, not a wound, a symbol of a life he had outgrown. One afternoon, while walking through a park filled with early summer light, Ethan sat on a bench and watched a couple argue quietly nearby. The tension was familiar, the imbalance obvious. He didn't judge, he simply recognized it. He thought of the man who once believed endurance was love, who believed silence was loyalty, who believed being chosen meant being needed. That man no longer existed. In his place stood someone who understood that real partnership didn't require self-erasure, that love didn't arrive with conditions, that walking away from what diminished you was not failure, it was clarity. Ethan stood, stretched, and continued down the path, sunlight warming his face. His life wasn't perfect. It didn't need to be. It was honest, intentional, free, and that, he knew now, was the rarest kind of wealth. Betrayal doesn't destroy you. It reveals you. It strips away illusions, exposes misaligned loyalties, and forces you to confront what you've been tolerating instead of choosing. Real loss isn't what leaves your life. It's what stays too long without earning its place. True power doesn't announce itself in anger or revenge. It shows up as restraint, patience, and the courage to rebuild quietly. Healing isn't about winning, it's about aligning your life with your values and refusing to negotiate your worth. If this story resonated with you, share where you're watching from and what time it is there. And if you're drawn to stories of betrayal, justice, and quiet transformation, make sure you're subscribed. There's more ahead.